Okay, so this is chapter 19 dealing with World War One, and we're going to be talking about the home front in this module. So, as we mentioned, prior to the war, Wilson was elected in 1916 overwhelmingly, and his slogan is, "He will keep us out of the war." So, of course, the war had already broken out, and there was a great deal of public sentiment against the war. Um, The role of women's suffrage, 10 of the 12 states that allowed it voted with Wilson, and of course, those are in the American West, where states had already approved women's suffrage. But Wilson introduces this idea of peace without victory, which was essentially his view of the New World Order, that we would have freedom of the seas, we would have restrictions on armaments, and that self-determinations for all nations, large and small, would be part of this New World Order. So there is this idea or this awareness that what's happening in the world with the war and coming out of the war would be changing the way people saw the world, really. Of course, freedom of the seas refers to the unrestricted submarine warfare of Germany, but you also have this concept of restriction of armaments. So weapons would be reduced. And this again kind of highlights his progressive attitude, and especially with self-determination. Self-determination is a very progressive concept, that people would be able to determine for themselves how they would be governed. So once the war begins, one of the top concepts we need to understand is the idea of total war, that all industries and resources of the economy and the nation are at the disposal of the war effort. And World War I takes this to a new level. World War II, I think, is less this way. But World War I, there's less of a distinction between combatants and civilians. That civilians, when cities are bombed, civilians are considered a war casualty. And it's not viewed as inappropriate use of weaponry to drop bombs on cities. That civilians, because they are living in a country that is involved in a war, become combatants. Prisoner of war camps, the scorched earth policy that we see, like with the rape of Belgium, that you leave nothing for the enemy to use. So you burn everything, you tear down, you blow up airfields, you blow up planes, tanks, weaponry, whatever. Unrestricted submarine warfare is certainly an important part of total warfare. Killing of civilians who might be aiding the resistance. Forced labor prisoners and civilians. So if you're captured by an enemy, you were put into labor camps. Attacking countries without a declaration of war. You might want to say this about the United States and Germany in terms of the submarine warfare. You could make that argument that it's very much a part of total war. And the rationing of war materials. This means there's sacrifice on the home front. And this has a propaganda component to it as well, because it means that Americans are feeling the pinch, that they're feeling like they're doing something that will benefit the war effort. And Wilson calls this the great cause of freedom. The war is a crusade rather than a political statement. And Wilson specifically saw this as a crusade for democracy. Remember, he holds off on the declaration of war until the provisional government of Russia is established, which is a democratic system. So that he can claim that the Allies are fighting for democracy and freedom. But World War I was the progressives' war, and a lot of progressives saw the social possibilities of war, that you could reform society, that you can instill a sense of national unity and self-sacrifice. That's where propaganda and rationing come in, and expanding social justice. Meaning that you are bringing freedom, you're not only fighting for it, but you're also bringing it home. And so during the wartime state, you have a number of things that are developed. The Selective Service Act of May 1917 drafts about 24 million men. Military growth, you go from 120,000 to 5 million men serving in the military. You have the creation of the War Industries Board that monitors factory output for war material. War Labor Board, which handles complaints about labor, and also encourages men and women to serve in the factories, to work in the factories. And you have a rise in corporate taxes. That is because war is business, and corporations, large corporations, are making money through the government buying all of this war material that they're putting out in the factories. The Committee of Public Information was a group formed within the government to handle the passage of information, but also to encourage people to become part of the war effort. This has a number of different outcomes. One is the 4-Minute Men, and these were about 750,000 men that were recruited that in the course of a four-minute speech, they were able to talk on the war and why it's so important for the United States to be part of the war. And this was a way to encourage people to support the war, and they would go, to organizations or churches or what have you in order to get the word out about the war. The news division handled the official bulletin, which would pass information from the government into newspapers and magazines. The film division had some movies, Pershing's Crusaders, America's Answer to the Hun, and Under Four Flags, that were all patriotic. You can see the picture on the right, Pershing's Crusaders, with the knights kind of as a shadowy figure in the background. And the division of pictorial publicity, this is where your propaganda comes in. They're doing posters, buttons, and cartoons, all in support of the war. In terms of rationing, you have the Food and Fuel Control Act passed in August of 1917. Herbert Hoover, who will eventually become president, was in charge of the Food Administration, which was in charge of making sure that food made it to the war front over into Europe, but also the rationing took place. So you would have like meatless Mondays or sweetless Wednesdays. They also encouraged school children to create gardens, victory gardens, where they were growing their own produce that could supplement their diet so that they wouldn't be using as much food in the stores. The Fuel Administration under Harry Garfield was tasked with making sure that there was enough fuel, coal, energy getting to the factories, but also getting to the war front. Some of their ideas, they instituted daylight savings time year-round. They shortened work nights for factories, especially those producing civilian goods. And then you would have like heatless Mondays, which was weekday rationing of energy. So some of the images that we see, of course, they kind of cover the gambit. You've got these kids who are creating a victory garden. You have Help Crush the Menace of the Seas. Of course, that's aimed towards the U-boats. You can see off in the distance in the waves, there's an American ship. You have a woman reaching her hands out, be patriotic, save your country's pledge, sign your country's pledge to save the food. So again, this is about rationing, and that's an embodiment of America. And then you kept fit and defeated the Hun. Venereal disease was a great deal, it was a huge issue, both in World War I and World War II. And so there's a real push within the armed services to lessen cases of venereal disease. Of course, in those days, they didn't have a lot of the things that we have today, but nonetheless, it was a major issue for them um, to try and curb. So, one of the things that comes out of World War One is this term of coercive patriotism. Patriotism was always supposed to be kind of a free act. You love your country. It shouldn't be something that's coerced out of you. Um, but you have a number of things that take place in America during World War One that kind of fit with this kind of what would seem as an oxymoron. Um, you have pageants, in schools and in communities with big displays of the American flag. You have slacker raids. These were raids on clubs, movie theaters, bars, and if you didn't have a draft card, then you could be arrested. Um, Lynching of Frank Little. This is the picture in the center at the top. He was a socialist who was outspoken against the war, and he made one too many speeches because somebody came along and killed him, lynched him. I believe they hung him from a tree. But you can also see how the body was damaged. And you have Congress pass this Espionage and Sedition Act. And this was seen as one of the most coercive portions of um, the Congress passes. And it's passed on June 15, 1917, along with the Trading with the Enemy Act, intended to prohibit interference with military operations and recruitment, and to prevent insubordination in the military, and to prevent the support of the United States enemies during the World War. Supreme Court actually ruled that this did not infringe upon freedom of speech. And of course, this is wartime, and the court's going to look at it differently. But this is largely how a lot of the opponents of World War I get either jailed or in some cases they get deported. It made it a crime to convey information with the intent to interfere with the operation or success of the U.S. military. So if you were passing along secrets or you were telling, the enemy, oh, well, there's a large contingent of men, getting ready to sail off to Europe aboard a ship, it could be anything. But largely what it does is it gives the government the opportunity to announce open season on any of the outspoken socialists or anti-war activists in the United States. There's an anti-German crusade. Sauerkraut becomes known as Liberty Cabbage, hamburgers, Liberty Sandwich. German composers were removed from any of the symphony concerts. In fact, there is a conductor who was arrested during World War I for playing a German composer. I'm not sure if it was Beethoven, but it was a German composer. In some schools in the West, they were using German because a lot of the German, there were pockets of German residents out west, and so these states outlaw German communications in schools, and it's strictly in English. And in some cases, there are schools and colleges that debate whether to teach German at all. Now, the picture in the upper right is a man who he's a German resident of the United States, citizen of the United States, who gets tarred and feathered. So that's what it looks like when you tar and feather someone. So there's this rising distrust of radical or leftist organizations. And this largely comes about through the Alien and Sedition Acts, but also because in 1919 there's a steel strike in Chicago. And what the workers were trying to do was raise awareness of the working conditions in the factories. And it has the direct opposite result. American people overwhelmingly support the government in crushing the strike and literally just forcing the workers out the door, firing them, and then hiring strike breakers. So public opinion is definitely turning against the unions. You have the IWW, which um, begins to lose its influence within the United States, largely because of its socialist ties to the anti-war movement. Palmer raids, Attorney General Mitchell Palmer had a number of organizations raided for anti-war material. In many cases, members of these organizations were arrested and held without charges for months. The radical division of the FBI is a new division that's opened up under the oversight of J. Edgar Hoover, who will eventually become the head of the FBI. But his job is to scope out anti-war and socialist organizations and then get dirt on them so that they can be shut down. Eugene V. Debs, who was the socialist candidate for president for several years, is arrested. And this is all part of this kind of Red Scare. The idea that communism, socialism were bad for the United States, and Americans needed to come together and put a stop to these organizations. As I mentioned, some of these radicals were deported, including Emma Goldman. And this is what they call the Soviet Ark. There's a couple of pictures, the one at the bottom of Uncle Sam saying it's more blessed to give to receive. Basically, these radicals who were supporting the Russian Revolution overwhelmingly and calling for a revolution within America, they were arrested, put on a ship, and sent to Finland, where they would eventually go to Russia. And Goldman was one of those, and her longtime companion, Alexander Berkman. So one of the big issues, of course, is immigration. And during this period, there's several key factors that are going on within the world which are causing immigration to rise. You've got political turmoil, obviously, in Europe and Asia. You have the Russian Revolution, where the revolution originally started with a provisional government, and then you have the Bolsheviks under Lenin who began to topple the provisional government and call for a people's revolution. And this is when communism comes about within Russia. It takes a while for them to seize control, but the political instability is forcing a large number of opponents of Lenin, who may be radicals themselves, but of a different sort, to come to the United States or attempt to come to the United States. Other areas of unrest, Bavaria, Ireland, Spain, and India. 1919, you have 4 million workers going on strike, which, again, strikes are not seen as, they're not seen favorably by the American people. The Americans are leery of any strike because they see it as a radical element trying to damage the United States. And even within the United States, we start to see racial violence exploding, especially in the summer of 1919. And the pandemic of the Spanish flu causes a great deal of unrest really throughout the world. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So you start seeing restrictions taking place. The Supreme Court upholds sterilization for the mentally ill. That's anybody within the United States, but certainly immigrants that are coming in who are deemed unworthy or non-desirable could face sterilization. But what's interesting is you start to see some exceptions coming in. So like literacy tests are temporarily lifted for Mexican immigrants. Why? Because there's labor shortages in the Southwest. Segregation still exists in the Southwest, where these workers are treated as secondary human beings, but they're needed for their labor. Puerto Ricans become American citizens. They're given American citizenship in order to diffuse the independence movement that is growing in Puerto Rico. They still couldn't vote for president, and they didn't have representation in Congress, like voting representation. They did have someone who would sit in on Congress, but they could not vote. And then you have the gentleman's agreement between Teddy Roosevelt and Japan that no more immigration except wives and children of men already in the United States would exist. So we're beginning to see the start of some immigration restrictions, which will become full-blown. And you have the push in terms of immigration for what they call Americanization. So this is the idea that you're going to take raw material, being immigrants, and you're going to change them or convert them into being better citizens. One of the ways they do this is Henry Ford creates his $5 day plan, which essentially says that if workers are not paid enough money, then they are distracted on the job. And so this is his way of saying, I'm going to lessen the chance that these workers will come, that will be troubled by money, that they'll come to work and they'll be happier employees. Okay. So he creates basically you're getting paid $5 a day. But here's what you have to do in order to have your $5 a day plan, and you have to agree to all of this. To qualify for the pay increase, workers had to abstain from alcohol, not physically abuse their family, not take in boarders, keep their homes clean, and contribute regularly to a savings account. So he creates this sociological department, which was in charge of inspecting the homes and making sure that these people who were getting the $5 a day were doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so on the right, you'll see two pictures of a shack and then the interior. And then what the sociology department is trying to do is to get them to live in a nice, clean-cut American home, and they would have a clean bedroom with bed frames. They're not living on the floor or in squalor. And Ford takes responsibility for this and says, you know what, this is what I'm doing to help make America a great power. They also have melting pot pageants, which is what these big pictures on the right are all about. That you're recognizing these immigrants for going through this training course where they learn how to speak English, they learn about American culture, they learn how to be productive citizens. So in terms of African Americans, we've talked about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. We've touched a little bit on the activism during the early 1900s. I mentioned the Niagara movement before, and this was an organization that Du Bois participated in that heavily influenced the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And the NAACP is formed in 1909 following the Springfield, Illinois race riot, which took place around Chicago. And the NAACP had their offices in New York, and the picture, the center bottom, is a picture of the flag that they would hang out the window. So every day that there was a lynching reported, they would have the sign out front. Du Bois also served as the editor of the newsletter The Crisis, which was a very important piece of literature going into the South and into places where activism was desperately needed. So African Americans react to World War I a little bit differently. It creates an incredible opportunity for them. And this is when we start to see the Great Migration. The Great Migration is the single largest migration of people within the United States up until this point in American history. And what you have is A number of things are driving this. You have jobs in the North. You got these wartime industries and labor agents who are traveling into the South to sign contracts with African American men and women to come back up north and to work in the factories. You have strict immigration regulations, which are cutting off the supply of immigrant labor that most of these factories relied on. You have racial violence with lynchings throughout the South during this period. And you have the end of the cash crop economy. Cotton is grown throughout the South, but you have the introduction of the boll weevil, which was this little beetle thing that ate the cotton bud right out of the cotton flower. So it decimates the cotton crop for a number of years in the United States, such that many African American families literally get up in the middle of the night, pack up their stuff, and leave and head north because there's nothing. They owe all of this money to the landowner, and there's no way they can pay them back. So they just are like, you know what, we're out of here. We're gonna leave. And you have family and communal connections. In some cases, you have families that pick up and leave together. In other cases, you have entire towns that will pack up and leave the South and head north. And so white Southerners have to react to this because this is a major concern. Your labor force that has been, cultivating cotton for generations is now gone. So some white Southerners make concessions to black laborers. In St. Augustine, there's the creation of a brand new African American high school in St. Augustine. They try to introduce immigrant labor, but the immigrants actually come back and say, you know what, we're not working for this amount of money. You're going to have to pay us more. And so that doesn't work. Escalating racial violence and laws against labor agents. In some cases, you have men with loaded shotguns that are standing on the platforms of railroad stations, so that if a labor agent came off the train, they were immediately put back on it, and they quickly got the message that they were not wanted in that town because they were trying to recruit African Americans to move north. Postmasters began monitoring the mail. You have in some cases where magazines like The Crisis or the New York Age newspaper are literally thrown away so that African Americans, could not read about the opportunities or the job possibilities in the North. And so here's the map showing between 1916 and 1930. And the main thing to focus on these arrows is that these arrows follow railroad lines. So the railroads are avenues for African Americans to escape the South. And what's interesting is they're not just going, to the north. They're going to the Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, but also to Oakland and San Francisco and Los Angeles. And that's where a lot of these industries are for wartime production. Looking at the black population 1910 to 1920, you can see some pretty significant increases, especially in places like Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago. So here's where, here's where Woodrow Wilson kind of earns his nickname of, or not really nickname, but his reputation as kind of a racist, is that he has a special screening of The Birth of a Nation, which is the movie that celebrates white dominance over black Reconstruction. This is an outcrop of Dunning's plan to idolize the white Southern planter. In many cases in this movie, blacks are depicted as lazy, corrupt, and that Reconstruction was a huge failure because of the black man, and that all he wants to do is be with white women and that sort of thing. So it really reinvigorates a number of stereotypes. Wilson has a private screening in the White House and states, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true." Um, there are riots that break out in cities where Birth of a Nation is shown. African Americans largely are horrified by this movie. Um, and really, Birth of a Nation is the reason why we start to have the second rise of the KKK in the country. So during the summer of 1919, you have what they call the Red Summer. And largely what this is are violent attacks between African Americans and whites. And at the heart of this is the demobilization from World War I, where now soldiers are coming back from Europe and these white men are competition for jobs and housing. In northern cities, you have groups like the African Blood Brotherhood who help patrol the neighborhoods to ensure that violence does not break out between whites and blacks. And people are essentially calling out to the president, saying, we appeal to you to have your country undertake for its racial minority that which you forced Poland and Austria to undertake for their racial minorities. So you're talking about self-determination for the world, but you don't talk about self-determination for your own country. In 1919, more than 250 people died in riots, mostly in northern cities. But you also have dozens of lynchings that take place. In some cases, African American soldiers who are coming back from Europe are killed before they can even get home because they're in their uniform. And some white person got upset that they were, wearing their uniform out in public. And this is a similar thing that will happen in World War II. At the end of World War II, there's this recognition of we went and we fought for democracy and we fought for freedom, but now we have to come back and face the same old South. And many African Americans were not okay with that. And certainly we have activism that begins to kind of take a worldview. And Marcus Garvey is kind of the forefront leader of this Pan-African movement, which was basically calling on African Americans as well as anybody from Africa or descended from people from Africa to come together and recognize that Africa has a unique culture, and the descendants should recognize that and celebrate it. That it's not something negative; it's something positive and good. He argues that they have a shared history and a racial pride, and this is really the first time many African Americans are hearing any of this. That their race is something to be proud of, and unfortunately, they haven't heard that before. Garvey himself comes from Jamaica, which was a British colony, and he forms this organization called the United Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, which chapters of this organization pop up across the country. And it blended a cultural, religious, and social attitudes into one organization for the uplifting of African history, African pride, and culture. He writes the Universal Negro Catechism, which was a series of, it was a book about trying to instill racial pride in Africans across the world. And he launches the Black Star Line, which was a parody of White Star Line, but with the intent of returning Africans to Africa, namely to Liberia. The United States doesn't like Garvey. And Garvey, incidentally, by the way, did not like Booker T. Washington or Du Bois. But So the United States was looking for some way to get Garvey and to deport him. And so when he sends out these notices about the Black Star Line returning to Africa, he had leased the boats. He did not actually own the boats. And so in the advertisement, he talks about the fact that they own these boats. And so the United States comes back and says, well, you're committing mail fraud because you're lying to these people in these flyers. So they arrest him for mail fraud and then deport him. But key thing here is that this is an important step towards what we'll see happening next. And so the other big issue is the Spanish flu pandemic, really, because Spanish flu coming out of World War II spreads throughout the world, and it frightens people to the sense that churches stop meeting, schools close, movie theaters close, anywhere where people congregate begin to shut down. And thousands and thousands of people die during this epidemic. And just as quickly as it comes about, it quickly goes away. And there's really no kind of rhyme or reason to how it happened or why it eventually just kind of dissipates. But it frightens people to the extent that they are terrified to go out into public. And it's across the United States, but also really across the world, because countries throughout the world lose a big chunk of their population due to this flu. So you can see the difference between influenza mortality age distributions of the 1918 epidemic and normal epidemics. You can see the number of people who, or the ages in which the death takes place. Obviously, the younger people and the more elderly people have a high rate of death. But what's interesting is you have this spike around the age of, like 15 to 34. There's this kind of rise that takes place. And most of these are people who have fought in the war. So there is a correlation between World War I and the pandemic, although historians are still trying to figure that one out.